Hello, everybody, and welcome to the #Adstudents weekly podcast, where you'll be joined by myself, Billy Little, Katie Rushmer, and Henry Brown, where we're going to be discussing hot topics in the ad industry. Now, today the question is, should advertising institutions utilise shock advertising tactics within charity campaigns? Let's discuss. Okay, so we'll start this podcast with a little advertising campaign. Well, I say little, it got a lot of brand and media attention. So, Save the Children's Still the Most Shocking Second a Day. It features a little girl on her birthday, and then it shows a compilation of different scenes, and gradually they get worse and more shocking and shocking and shocking. So I assume you've all seen it, and I just thought, what are your opinions on it? Do you think it was a success? Do you think it wasn't? Explain.
Now, personally, I haven't seen the 2016 Still the Most Shocking Second a Day video. I've seen the 2014 one, where it's just the most shocking second a day video. I assume they basically have the same almost story arc going on in them.
Yeah, it's almost an extension of the first campaign. Cool.
So, yeah, I think it's definitely effective. Definitely effective to get the message across to the audience, because a lot of people in the UK haven't experienced things like the little girl in this advert. A lot of people haven't experienced things like refugees have, refugee children have. They've had very different life experiences to us, and I think it sort of almost puts it into context for people who do live in the UK and haven't had that kind of experience, to see it sort of almost happening on our own turf. Almost like putting it in a different image rather than just hearing about what's happened in other countries. It's more real to people who are living here if it's portrayed here.
Yeah, exactly. Henry, what's your stance?
Well, that's quite an interesting one, really. Honestly, my stance towards a shocking advertising is it almost seems like the perfect form of encoding marketing communications for charities. Because the whole point of shock advertising is essentially to violate social norms and to make people think, and to kind of like get people to really think about what the advert's trying to say. And the whole point behind charities actually producing advertisements, but not only is it to educate, but it's also to inform and drive engagements for their cause. Now, would an advert that doesn't play on the heartstrings, would that do as well in spurring people to donate towards Save the Children? We don't necessarily know.
That's an interesting question, actually, because I suppose it's the ones that are a bit more controversial get a bit more public face. So we don't necessarily know about the ones that are less controversial or have less shock advertising tactics in them, because they have less public face. So I guess we don't know how successful or not successful they are because of that reason.
Yeah, you see, this is why when it comes to the question of should charities use shock advertising tactics, part of me wants to say yes. Because from a short-term marketing perspective, it's quite clear that using shock advertising effectively can help break through the noise. Particularly within communication, and grab immediate public attention. I mean, I've got some statistics here for this campaign we're talking about, and it reached just under 5 million views and 124,000 likes on YouTube alone, with tons of user-generated content to follow.
Yeah.
So that's a clear example that if used effectively, shock advertising tactics can significantly break through the noise and grab media attention. So that kind of leans me towards the answer of yes, they should. Obviously, there are reasons why they shouldn't, which I'm sure we'll discuss later on. But that's why I think perhaps it is acceptable for charities to use shock advertising tactics.
Yeah, I do think that's very interesting. Did you say it was 5 million views, did you say?
Just under 5 million views, yeah.
On YouTube. That's definitely quite interesting.
Yeah, this is for the second campaign.
Yeah, because the one that they released last year, Save the Children, released last year, 2019, was titled I Am the Future. That one was less shock advertising and more emotive, to sort of get us invested in almost like the character of the girl that was portrayed before us. And that has sort of significantly less views on YouTube, because you said it's just under 5 billion. This one's just over 31,000. Which is a big difference. between the
I
two.
suppose there's two potential reasons for that, I would assume then. One, the fact that this is a recent campaign, so it's had less time to be seen.
Yeah, that makes
But
sense.
I would also that's quite interesting to me, because does that then suggest that perhaps emotion in advertising for charities specifically isn't as effective as shock?
Or maybe you need a balance of the two to get enough attention, or media attention and public attention to them.
I would say that the balance of shocking and emotive themes honestly works incredible. So that's why all of the the campaign that I've chosen to look at was WaterAid. And
They're quite a classic one for the
Yeah.
shock advertising.
it's a classic one for shock advertising because it shows what people in this world actually live like. Like, not everyone has access to clean water, but the way that they use emotive themes is through showing the impact it has on children. And that's exactly the same towards Billy's advertisement with Save the Children.
You see, that's interesting to me, because I've got another example. It's Bernardo's Believe in Me 2019 campaign, and rather than using shock, they've kind of gone for a more emotive approach, and it shows a 14-year-old girl telling her online grooming and sexual abuse story whilst a lizard slowly approaches her and she's becoming very emotional. But actually, they reported that they received a short-term spike in donations, but nothing long-term. So does that perhaps suggest that by using emotion and combining it with shock actually reduces the long-term support they get from audiences? And does shock only give you short-term donations rather than long-term, because it sets out to seek an immediate response, and it's not anything really that you can hold on to in the long term for a consumer?
Yeah, I suppose that's sort of a good point to hit on, because a lot of advertisements, or advertisers should I say, especially charity work, they get the media attention from, and sort of like the public attention for their adverts, from repetitive releases of advertisements. So if they released many shocking and emotional advertisements, then they're more likely to sort of be ingrained in consumers' heads and viewers' heads. Whereas if it was something that was sort of more light-hearted, I think people are less likely to invest in it. And I think it'd be very difficult for charities to do that kind of thing as well, because I mean, that would just be a bit of a minefield to try and do something about a serious topic that's a bit more light-hearted. I think some advertisements for charities do that well. For example, Make-A-Wish Foundation, they have some really brilliant ads out there that sort of show the joy of sort of giving children their wishes, and it shows the work that they're doing. It shows the positive side of what their work is. It's not sort of trying to negatively attract the attention of the public.
Yeah. Now, this is kind of like a personal opinion for me, and I want your opinions on what I'm about to say. But I find that if charities use shock advertising too much, that the actual message becomes a little bit saturated, and I don't feel less shocked. I don't feel as shocked if I see something a lot. So if I'm constantly being shocked as a viewer, that shock actually reduces and the message feels saturated. Do you feel the same way, or do you think that's just me?
I definitely agree with that, to be honest. Especially going back to the WaterAid advert, I think a lot of WaterAid adverts have the same similar themes and sort of like shock tactics, to the point where as an audience we're desensitized to it now. We're less likely to be shocked by it because we've seen it over and over again. It doesn't have the same effect. What about you, Henry? What do you think?
Well, based on what I've seen, the advert in question that I looked at for WaterAid, it was published in 2017, and it has the exact same format as virtually every WaterAid advert has for the past however many years. Starts off saying, urgent appeal, call this number, and then cuts to footage of children in third world countries. It is repetitive. I think the whole point of shocking advertising is to actually kind of break the norms.
Yeah, I think they've definitely done a good job of sort of being consistent with their advertising and their branding, which is something that, as a brand, that's something that we were always told at uni, that is really important to brands, to be consistent, because then the audience know who you are. But at the same time, in that kind of format, everyone is less likely to pay attention, because it's the same thing over and over again, the same format over and over again. People think, oh, we know this is WaterAid, but we've seen it many, many times before. So maybe from WaterAid's perspective, they need to try and take a different angle towards their advertising to try and get more public engagement, not just public attention, but public engagement. And they have done that with a few things. I think they've had quite a few celebrity endorsements on their advertisements, which I think worked quite well for them. But at the same time, with that format, they kind of need to get out of that cycle. I understand the whole urgent appeal message, because it always will be. I mean, there are people living out there without water, which is crazy for us to think, because obviously we have it to hand day to day, and we're quite privileged in that sense. But yeah, I think they kind of need to change the structure of their adverts to try and engage people more, because people are less likely to be engaged if they're watching the same thing over and over again.
Like, throw a little creativity into it, because as you were saying, it very much creates a sort of divide. So it almost makes it seem to possible UK audiences or viewers in the Western world, oh yeah, this is just something that happens over there. Whereas, again, going back to the second a day advert that Billy showed, that talks about how children would deal in a civil war in the UK.
Yeah, it makes it more relatable to the audience.
Like it brings the issue into our society.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So are we kind of all in the agreement here that shock advertising tactics are perhaps more effective for generating short-term brand awareness than actually encouraging long-term sustainable change from audiences?
I think it's more socially acceptable for a charity to use shock advertising, because it's almost a case of the ends justify the means.
Yeah.
It's like they're upsetting you to help others.
Yeah, so it's almost as though they have a duty to raise awareness, even if that is a distressing topic to talk about. They still need to expose viewers to it, because it's a real problem.
Exactly. Now, if a for-profit company did it, then again, there have been good examples, there have been bad examples.
I think a really good example of a company that used shock advertising for profit was Corsadil, when they had their advert about that gum disease can lead to tooth loss. And it was a woman getting ready to go out, and then she's brushing her teeth, and there's blood in when she spits when she brushes her teeth. And then at the end, she looks in the mirror and she lifts up her lip, and one of her teeth is missing. And that, I think, is very unethical, because they're doing it for profit. Obviously, to some extent, it is truthful, but gum disease does not always lead to tooth loss, and it is treatable. It doesn't mean, if your gums bleed when you brush your teeth, you're going to lose your teeth. Some people's gums bleed if they accidentally brush too hard on one particular occasion, or repeatedly. It doesn't mean that you have gum disease. It could be something else. Yeah.
Was there any sort of backlash from the ASA towards that ad? Because it very much has like an undertone of, if you don't use our toothpaste, then you'll get gum disease. It very much seems like they're presenting like a terrifying problem, but saying, we have the solution.
See, I'd be interested to see if that breached any misleading codes. Yeah. I'm glad you've mentioned the ASA, Henry, because my next argument then that suggests advertising institutions shouldn't use shock advertising tactics in charity campaigns is the ethical business perspective, with one arguing that actually advertising as an institution has a wider social responsibility not to generate widespread harm and offence, a code that's outlined in the ASA. So do you think that means shock advertising shouldn't exist because it's likely to cause harm and offence?
Well, do you think that means that charities are more likely to avoid any sort of ASA sanctions because of the cause that they're doing it for?
So I think it's half the reason why I'm sort of on the fence as to whether it's a good idea for charities to use shock advertising compared to them not, because there's a big difference between shock advertising and showing reality. Now, showing a representation of what is a reality to some people might be shocking, but it's not a fictional created thing by the advertising company or by the charity. It's something that's actually happening. It's showing a reality to viewers, and that it can sort of be their way in to show people, because it's saying this is happening, this is real, we're not making this up. And that's why I think charities can do that sort of shock advertising, because it's showing a form of reality for some people.
Yeah.
One advertisement that I was looking at is Hide and Seek by Refuge and Picture House. I actually do think this is a very well, sort of production value wise, a very well done advert, and storytelling wise, I do think it's a very powerful advert, because it just shows a boy sitting and counting, covering his eyes, and then it, as the advert goes on, it includes background noise of sort of parents arguing. Refuge is a charity to help women and children escape abuse and start new lives, just so you know what that charity does. And they partnered with Picture House Cinemas for this particular advert, and obviously had a very good advert outcome. However, looking at the view count on YouTube, they've only got 2,732 views on the Picture House YouTube channel for this ad. So I don't remember seeing it on TV myself, advertised on TV. It was released last year in April, so it's had about a year out on broadcast. So I don't know if it went out on broadcast television or it was just used in online campaigns. But it is very interesting. Personally, I think it's a very emotive advert, because at the end it shows the boy and his mother in sort of a safe home where they can thrive and communicate, and it doesn't just show the boy hiding, because the purpose of the advert was to show that most domestic abuse in a family home happens in the presence of a child, and that's not something that children should be exposed to when they're that young. But I do think that is a really good example of showing what is a reality for some people and showing the positive side of what they can do about it. So it's showing what their lives were like and how they can help turn that around, how they can help change it. That's just a really good example, I think, of what it is. And I don't think it's shocking. I think it's just a good way of showing the reality.
Yeah, it's like there's I think there's a fine line between like shocking someone into action and also actually letting them know, look, whatever you do to help us, it does help real people. It's almost like showing the impact of people's goodwill in like a way that doesn't make people feel guilty for perhaps not doing it.
This leads to my kind of stance that when it comes to fundraising, the chance of a radical campaign motivating new givers and donators and supporters may outweigh the potential risk of offending just a few people. So that kind of motivates me to want to say, yes, charities should use shock advertising tactics. But then I can also understand what we're saying from an ethical perspective and from an emotional perspective. Perhaps being more emotive may generate more long-term support. But I can definitely see why charities do shock advertising so much. But I think perhaps there's a need to be cautious of being too repetitive and at risk of, as you were saying earlier, Katie, desensitising everything.
Yeah, one of the ASA's codes is under, I think it's security and safety. Yeah, safety and security. And under that it has fear and distress. So as well as the harm and offence, it also could potentially be in breach of fear and distress. But that's what I mean, is where sort of the fine line is between showing a reality and causing fear and distress in the audience. Yeah, that's where the fine line is sort of, can charities almost get away with it because they are showing a reality and they're not just using shock advertising for the sake of shock advertising. It's more informing and educating the viewers as to what does happen, what can happen. You're drinking honey again.
I like to drink honey, all right? Leave me alone.
When are we going to include a word from our sponsors, Billy?
I'm not sponsored by honey. I just like to drink it, all right?
Billy, we know you're a secret influencer. Like, stop trying to hide it.
I'm a honey influencer.
I see the marketing that you've been doing.
Yeah, on a podcast where no one's going to see me.
Well, they know honey's in the other podcast now, right?
Some ASMR of me drinking honey. So, we're coming up to the end of our slot. If we could just summarise quickly then what our conclusions are on whether charities should use shock advertising tactics. Katie, we'll start with you.
So, yeah, like I said before, I do think that to an extent charities can use shock advertising because it is showing a reality. If it goes beyond that, then obviously that's something that would be needed to be taken on a case-by-case basis. But to be honest, I don't think many charities do use things that are outside of their sort of what they cover. If it's something that is very outrightly sort of that is inappropriate to be broadcast, then I guess that's kind of a whole other can of worms. But to be honest, most of the adverts that I have seen for charity advertising don't include that kind of thing. It is just showing sort of like an emotional approach, but also shocking someone at the same time. But it is showing a reality, so it's technically not just shock advertising, it's just sort of informing the viewers of what it is. So I think in that sense, yes, they can use it. But also, if it's just shocking for the sake of shocking, then that's just unethical and shouldn't be done.
Okay, Henry, begin.
In essence, I think it's more socially acceptable for like non-profit organisations to use shock advertising because I don't know if we're keeping in the example of the toothpaste company, Katie, but as you said, that toothpaste company, they pushed an ad that showed the potential for gum disease and kind of subtly implying that would happen if they didn't use their product. I think that with charities, like that, the reason that they may use controversial advertising is to benefit other people. It's not to line the pockets of the company. So I think in that sense, it's totally ethical. Well, not totally ethical, but I'd say it's more socially acceptable for them to do it.
Yeah, as long as it's not for profit,
Yeah.
which is what charities are. They are not for profit organisations.
Exactly, it's to benefit the people who are less fortunate than those watching.
And what about you, Billy?
Well, I think it's safe to say that from this podcast and the viewpoints of you guys, that actually there are clearly pros and cons of using shock advertising tactics for charity campaigns. I think you're definitely right in saying that actually there is an ethical responsibility not to generate widespread harm and offence, as outlined in the ASA. However, it could also be argued that there is a need and somewhat necessity to raise awareness of important societal issues. Equally, it could be argued that utilising shock advertising tactics could generate spikes in short-term donations. So one could argue that from a short-term marketing perspective, utilising shock advertising tactics in charity campaigns should be used. So my kind of stance is that there's a need for a caution. I don't think that charities shouldn't use shock advertising, but I think there's a need to be sensitive and also not to be too repetitive for fear of desensitising important topics and issues. So there you have it, everybody. That is the conclusion to our #Adstudents podcast episode 2. I hope you all enjoyed listening. We'll be producing another one next week. If you have any suggestions for topics you'd like us to discuss, please feel free to pop them down in the comments. And I wish you all the best in this unprecedented, strange times, and whilst you go and relax, I'm going to drink some more honey. See you next week. Bye.